It looks like people have had a chance to get in. So good evening. Thank you all for joining us for the 65th annual Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Awards. I am Ann Chesky-Smith. I'm the executive director at the Western North Carolina Historical Association. I hope most or all of you are already familiar with our work and this award. But if not, I'm just going to change the slide here. This is the front of our webpage here, and we're a nonprofit organization that was founded in the early 1950s to preserve and promote the history of our area. We operate the Smith McDowell House, which you can see there in the center, in Asheville, which is currently open for private pre-booked tours. If you haven't had a chance to visit us this year, admission is always free for our members, and we've got an excellent exhibit right now in our gallery rooms about North Carolina in World War I, which also includes a section about the 1918 flu epidemic, which seems especially timely right now in 2020. We certainly hope that you will consider becoming a member of the Western North Carolina Historical Association if you aren't already. Besides free admission to our museum, our members also receive free or discounted admission to our programs. We'll be rolling out a new slate of programming for 2021, which should be posted up on this website in early January, including a Western North Carolina history lecture series, a literary series which features Western North Carolina authors, a series of socially distanced historic tours, and a lot more. We really hope that you will join us. And for more information about our membership program and our new programming, you can visit our website, which is wnchistory.org. But tonight, we're here for the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award celebration. This award was originated to recognize and celebrate authors who are living and writing in Western North Carolina or who are writing about Western North Carolina. And in most cases, those things are both true. This award was one of WNCH's first major undertakings as an organization, and the very first award went to Wilma Dykeman for the French Broad in 1955. It's also important to note that this award would not be possible without the support of the Lipinski family, who helped found the award, as well as our current backers, Dr. Michael Sartisky and the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Advisory Board. We so much appreciate their continued support of literature in our region. So normally we would gather in person to celebrate our literary award finalists, who you see here with me tonight, but 2020 has been anything but normal. The silver lining, though, of meeting via Zoom this year is that all 6 of our finalists have been able to join us tonight to read from their work, including our winner, who is joining us from Canada. So before we get started with our authors, I did want to let you know that I'll be monitoring the Q&A box, and if we have time at the end, we'll let our authors field a few questions, and if you have any immediate questions, we'll try to answer that in the Q&A box as the evening progresses. We are trying to keep this right to an hour, and I know one big question will be, where can I buy these books? Well, I've included a slide. It'll be at the very end of the presentation, showing you where the authors prefer that you buy their publication from, and also some discount codes to purchase the books. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our moderator this evening, the committee chair of the selection committee, Dr. Catherine Frank. I'd like to say a really big thank you to Catherine and the entire selection committee. They've done a tremendous amount of work, if you can call reading all these wonderful publications work. But Catherine joined the WNCH board earlier this year and immediately stepped into the role of awards chair. And we are so grateful for her time and expertise. She's currently the executive director at the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of North Carolina at Asheville. And I'll let her introduce you to the other committee members. Catherine?
Thanks so much, Anne. I wanted to thank you for your work on this award, and also to thank Jacqueline Lowe, who is our Facilities and Communication Coordinator for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, who has arranged and is managing our webinar tonight. I also want to thank the members of the awards committee. It's been an honor to be part of a group that read carefully, appreciated deeply, debated civilly, and selected deliberately. The committee includes historians, scholars, university professors, fiction writers, editors, the director of the Wilma Dykeman Legacy, the director of the Thomas Wolfe State Historic Site, and a Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award winner. We represent different generations of readers, scholars, and teachers. Some of us have lived in the region all our lives, and some of us got here as quickly as we could. I want to thank Brandon Johnson, Leslee Johnson, Gordon McKinney, Tom Muir, Terry Roberts, and Jim Stokely for their expertise, care, and patience throughout the process. Although there were times when it was a challenge to find the hours in busy days to devote to serious reading, this group of readers and lovers of our region would all confess that this process is a great treat. We had the honor of losing ourselves in dozens of books that represented the range of talents, interests, and perspectives of meticulous scholars who capture our past and analyze our present, and literary artists who, with insight and imagination, create fictional worlds rooted in the reality of our region. We listened to the voices of people we have not heard clearly and often enough, and enjoyed familiar voices singing new songs. Each of the books added to our love of the complexity of a region too often reduced to stereotypes, a place that needs no elegy, but does demand that we pay attention to untold stories and unheard voices of a place and a people seen for too long through narrow or distorted points of view. We began our conversations as a committee by talking about our criteria for selection. We sought books that either depicted Western North Carolina or represented the talents of the writers and scholars of the region. We were looking for books that were well written and represented a strong or surprising point of view. We considered how best to weigh all of these criteria. We were humbled to think that in just 1 year, authors in our region produced so many works that exceeded our expectations and prompted us to see our world in new ways. It is a pleasure now to introduce our finalists in alphabetical order, who will each read from their work. Leah Hampton for her collection of short stories, F-Face, Susan Keefe, Roberta Jackson, and the members of the Junaluska Heritage Association for Junaluska, Oral Histories of a Black Appalachian Community, Courtney Lewis for her ethnographic study, Sovereign Entrepreneurs, Cherokee Small Business Owners and the Making of Economic Sovereignty, Rose McClarney, Laura Gray Street, and L.L. Gaddy for their anthology, A Literary Field Guide to Southern Appalachia, and Dale Neal for his novel, Appalachian Book of the Dead. We will end the program with the 2020 Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award winner, Sandra Muse Isaacs, reading from Eastern Cherokee Stories, A Living Oral Tradition and Its Cultural Continuance. Author Leah Hampton says that she writes about Appalachia, corpses, eco-anxiety, and smart women. Hampton is a graduate of the Mishner Center for Writers and has been awarded University of Texas Austin's Keene Prize for Literature, the James Hurst Prize for Fiction, and the Doris Betts Prize, and has held fellowships at Hedgebrook, the Adirondack Center for Writing, and the Stadler Center for Poetry at Bucknell University. She lives in the Blue Ridge Mountains near the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Speaking of the 12 stories in her first collection, Hampton has said, "What I'm really writing about and what the book is really doing is looking at the interdependency between people and the land. There are realities that are inescapable about the way we treat rural landscapes and rural people, particularly rural people who are marginalized in some ways. We do get cancer from the way we pollute our rivers, and our trees get mad at us for the ways we cut them down. A lot of these things are very personal, and one of the things fiction does is it allows you to tell a story that has a lesson without being preachy." Dr. Gordon McKinney of the award committee noted, Leah Hampton's short stories in this collection look at the underside of Western North Carolina life. With unsparing prose, she exposes the weaknesses of her characters and the harsh conditions that they must confront. Committee member Leslee Johnston notes, Leah Hampton's storytelling in this collection is rare, in that it is simultaneously harsh and compassionate. She shines a bright light on the weary faces of Appalachia in order to reveal the vulnerable side of human reality, where at the end of the day, everyone longs to be understood. And now Leah Hampton will read an excerpt from her work.
Oh, Leah, you're muted.
I got it. First glitch. We got it out of the way. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm so glad to be here. I'm very much an Asheville girl, and I used to work right next door to the Smith McDowell House. So this is a wonderful honor for me, and to be included with these amazing writers and all these wonderful books. So thank you for that. And thank you to the committee. My book is a collection of short stories that tries to feminize the landscape of Appalachia and also to represent the ecological diversity and the cultural diversity that we have here, like a lot of the books that are finalists tonight. And so that's obviously sometimes a difficult journey because of the ecological problems that we have, but I try to do it with a little bit of humor too. And so what I'm going to do is read just a very short excerpt from a story called Boomer, which some of you may recall. If you're from the area, you remember that in the fall of 2016, when this story takes place, we had some forest fires. And those forest fires kind of captivated or captured our interests in the region a lot more than the election did. And so this is a story that takes place during that election. I'm just going to read a very quick section from a story called Boomer about a firefighter named Larry. He switched from day shifts and went out in the night. Night work suited him. He could see the enemy and nothing else. He could focus. Larry fought for Hollow Rock every night through November. The teams were just barely staying ahead of the threats, which were legion, fierce, and scattered. First, they prayed for rain. When rain didn't come, they prayed for smoke, the death of wind, a cold fog to choke oxygen, douse sparks. Instead, the clear fall weather gave the blazes air, feeding every small hell. The forest went cinematic at night, with lit slithers of amber inching in chiaroscuro through the trees and blackness. Millions of orange cinders floated around Larry perpetually in the dark. Fire likes to jump, to send out emissaries. Each night, more ignited dander and duff, leaves, twigs, campsite detritus, swirled and arced over the ditches they dug and above the disused logging roads they used as lines of defense. Embers burned bright and small, like sprites carrying the news of fire. Larry wheezed inside his mask. His breaths echoed and pooled hotly on his upper lip. Even masked, he could taste the firebrands in the scorched air. They were lighted wicks uncandled, unbound tendrils eating themselves. They passed delicately in front of him, seeking hosts. When it was quiet, when no one was shouting, Larry heard the trees recoil. Branches crackled, trunks creaked and flinched from the bite of flame. Most of the embers burned themselves out, dissipating into charred vapor. Some he swatted or stomped. The ones he couldn't reach, the few that caught a wind, continued on in the thick ether above the forest, eventually coming to rest on fresh, dry victims in the distance. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Leah, for your work and for your reading tonight. And I hope everyone listening will be prompted to read these very powerful stories. Our next honoree or next finalist is Junaluska, Oral Histories of a Black Appalachian Community. It's the result of a participatory research project and a rare example of an ethnographic study of African Americans in Western North Carolina. This study was made possible because scholar Susan Keefe, a professor of anthropology at Appalachian State University, worked with community members of the Junaluska Heritage Association, including Roberta Jackson, to collect these stories while building a relationship of mutual trust. Although African Americans have always been part of Appalachian life, they are often invisible in the history and literature of the region. Junaluska makes visible the resilience of a community that included grocery stores, a school, Methodist and Mennonite Brethren churches, a barber shop, a social club called the Chocolate Bar, and most important, a sense of family connection. Historian Keefe sets the scene for us, providing an overview of residences and businesses built within the context of racism and discrimination in the larger community of Boone, North Carolina. The text is powerful because it focuses on transcripts of oral history, the voices, experiences, and memories of people who lived in the community throughout the 20th century. As Roberta Jackson, Junaluska resident and facilitator for the Junaluska Heritage Effort, has said, "We had resourceful people. I'm proud of the way they lived and persevered. We are happy to see the publication of this book, which documents our history and the lives of our people." Selection Committee member Brandon J. Johnson wrote, "I have lived most of my life within easy driving distance of Boone, and for most of that time knew nothing about Junaluska. This book provides a necessary window into a community that's been overlooked and underappreciated for too long." Keefe provides an excellent breakdown of the history of and change within this community, and the book does so largely by letting the story be told from the voices within. I would like to introduce Sandra Keefe and Roberta Jackson to read a passage.
There we are. It's Susan Keefe, and that's okay. But I would like to thank you for selecting our book as a nominee. I'm going to read briefly from the conclusion to my introduction to the book, and then turn things over to Roberta. Junaluska represents a familiar story of segregation and white domination of a Southern Black community. The story is less well known in the Appalachian Mountains, where Black communities were less common and more invisible than elsewhere in the South. Since its founding in the 19th century, Junaluska survived to a large extent by subsistence farming, its residents producing their own food and relying on mutual aid for help with other necessities. Until desegregation, work outside the community was restricted to low-paid, low-skilled jobs. Without automobiles for the first half of the 20th century, Junaluskans lived in a tightly knit, face-to-face community with dense social interactions and strong communal support. Times were hard for Black families, but the community buffered the bad times and countered them with positive experiences, especially within their families, in their schools, and in their churches. The 1960s civil rights movement and integration were painful, but they had important results. Education, housing, and job opportunities opened up, ones that could not have been imagined a generation earlier. Black people's lives improved, but the dark side was outmigration, social fragmentation of the community, and a lack of support for the elderly who remained. With attractive view lots near the university and downtown district, Junaluska will continue to be buffeted by the forces of gentrification and declining ethnic solidarity. The rise of the Junaluska Heritage Association has been one response to the community's perceived threats. As Junaluskans learn more about their cultural and genealogical heritage, they are clarifying their sense of ethnic identity and fortifying their resistance to forces destructive to their community. And now I want to introduce Roberta Jackson, and she's going to read from the life history of Reverend Rhonda Horton, who was born in 1895. He was one of the first Black pastors of Boone Mennonite Brethren Church and the moderator for the North Carolina District Conference of Mennonite Brethren Churches for over 30 years.
Thank you, Sue. I was born in 1895 in Boone. My family home was on what is now Queen Street. There wasn't a name for the street back then. North Street was just a lane. There were only 5 or 6 black families up on the hill when I was a boy. My father was June Horton. His mother, Appalachian Horton, was a slave in Caldwell County on the Yadkin River. That's where she was born. That's where he was born, just about the close of the Civil War. His mother died when he was a little boy, and he was brought to Watauga County and raised by his oldest brother. My mother was Betty Grimes, and she was born in Boone. Her mother was not a slave. She was born in this vicinity, and she never counted in the census as a Negro. My grandmother's name was Polly Grimes, and she was just as white looking as anybody. I don't know much about her parents, but I don't think her parents were slaves. Of course, she didn't pass for white. She passed as a colored woman, but her family was Indians and white people. When I was a boy, I was taught that white people hated black people and that white children were taught that blacks were mean. So the two races had nothing to do with each other. Once integration came along, the children of both races found out their parents had misled them. Now it's the parents who have the problem in adjusting. But when people here saw integration coming, they accepted it. It was much better here than in Atlanta, Georgia. We went there for a race relations meeting in the 1960s. People were surprised to hear that things were rather good in Boone. I just want to say that Pastor Horton was one of my heroes, and I really appreciate all that he did for our community. And I just want to say thank you for letting us put ourselves out there so that people know that we're here and that we matter. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan and Roberta, for sharing this very powerful story and for reminding us to pay more attention to the things that matter. Our next book is from author Courtney Lewis, who is an enrolled citizen of the Cherokee Nation, an associate professor at the University of South Carolina, Columbia in the Department of Anthropology and the Institute for Southern Studies. In spring 2020, she was Mellon Visiting Professor of Justice, Equality, and Community in Anthropology at Davidson College. She holds a doctorate in anthropology from the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and a master's and a bachelor's degree in economics. Her book, Sovereign Entrepreneurs, Cherokee Small Business Owners and the Making of Economic Sovereignty, is based on her fieldwork at the Qualla Boundary in 2009 and 2010 during the midst of the Great Recession. While businesses and corporations across the U.S. folded, small businesses in the Qualla Boundary of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians continued to thrive. In this ethnographic study, Dr. Lewis examines the critical role small businesses play for indigenous nations. The Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians has an especially long history of incorporated, citizen-owned businesses located on their lands that goes beyond casino gaming and natural resource-intensive enterprises. Small businesses represent economic sovereignty that sustains the nation both culturally and politically. Selection Committee member Leslee Johnson writes, Sovereign Entrepreneurs by Courtney Lewis explores, explains, and illuminates the indigenous economies of the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians from an economic and indigenous perspective. Through first-person narrative, Lewis reveals herself as an indigenous scholar, also affected by and invested in the subject matter she is writing about. The quest for viable, self-owned small business opportunities and the creative innovations indigenous small business owners are capable of accomplishing in a strong community that has weathered difficult times and will continue to endure and persist. Dr. Lewis, we look forward to your reading.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Catherine. And I also would like to give my appreciation to the Western North Carolina Historical Association Book Committee for including me and this book in the list of finalists alongside such fantastic writers that are here tonight. So the state of the world today reminds me very much of when my initial fieldwork took place. So the reading I chose, a small excerpt from my book, speaks to the experiences of small business owners on the Qualla boundary at that time. These kinds of times remind us that our resilience as Indigenous people, using tools that we have honed over millennia to support each other through these difficult moments, right? So here is a small excerpt from my book, speaking specifically to that moment in time. The Great Recession was in full swing by the time I moved to the mountains of Western North Carolina in 2009. Although the core of my field work spanned roughly 15 months, I had been commuting to the Qualla boundary for the years preceding and since that time, allowing me to see the changes that were taking place there and in the Southern Appalachian region as a whole. Gas prices had soared to well over $4 a gallon. Unemployment had grown to its highest since the Great Depression, and this caused visitors to the mountains to slow to a trickle. The freeways became nearly empty, even on major travel holidays like Memorial Day and the 4th of July. But poverty has never been a stranger to those living in the Appalachian Mountains, and small business owners had faced times like these before, either personally or through close family members who had carried their own businesses through similar periods, such as the 1973 OPEC oil crisis. After the initial 2008 Lehman Brothers corporate crash that accompanied the Great Recession, companies across the country began laying off their employees. US employment plummeted from a 1990 high of 65% to a 2009 low of almost 58%. In Cherokee, however, one small business owner, who I call Abe in the book, chose instead to go without a salary himself, sinking thousands of dollars into debt in order to keep his staff employed. He continued to buy artists' work, albeit in lesser quantities, so that their families could eat. And he kept his stores open. This was no easy feat, and the decision was not made without anguish or anger, as he related to me. To add salt to the wound, in 2009, 2 landslides blocked both major freeway access routes to North Carolina from the west, and a series of snowstorms blocked the section of 441 highway that traverses the Great Smoky Mountains National Park into Tennessee. Even if travelers could bypass the landslides to reach Cherokee, the threat of unpredictable ice storms meant that there was no guarantee that they would be able to return home. And in the midst of all of this, banks began refusing to loan money to small businesses. Bank of America was one of the worst offenders, having taken relief money from the federal government, but then refused to make loans for under $50,000 to small businesses. Their behavior may have earned them a class action lawsuit, but that did nothing to help the small business owners who were struggling to come out on the other side of a dismal year. Time and again, I heard stories from small business owners concerning their trials, trying to stay afloat through these years. Nancy Martin of Longhouse Funeral Home relayed to me. She says, the problem with the economic stimulus package and everything is that none filtered down to us, not a dime. Carl, a restaurant manager on the Qualla boundary, observed, it's a tougher year because people aren't spending as much money as they have been. Our customer loyalty, you might say, they're still here. It's just people are not spending as much money. They're not buying the higher ticket items. They're splitting plates. Darlene Winchester, the then head of the Cherokee Chamber of Commerce, reported that the hotels have been down about 10%. And then the shopping, she says, the shops, they're down and the restaurants are down. And that's the reason why cabins and campgrounds are up, because you can cook out or you can cook your meals in your cabin. And finally, Joel Queen, a prominent Eastern Band artist, commented, people think that we're becoming millionaires out here. And he's saying this because of the gaming, right? We're not becoming millionaires. We struggle just like everybody else. Artwork is very volatile market to be in because if the economy goes down, people don't have the money to invest much. If the economy's up, people will buy. But this hit us last October, a year ago, October. But we've made it a year in this economy. This book chronicles how these small business owners, for the most part, continue to survive during this time, providing employment, training, services, and goods to people within their communities and to the tourists to the Qualla Boundary. Their collective actions helping to provide the Eastern Band with a stable base in a shaky economic world. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for really opening our eyes to the history and the current state of the economy on the Qualla Boundary and reading a passage that sounds as if it would be very pertinent today. Our next finalist is A Literary Field Guide to Southern Appalachia, a book that reminds us of the natural and cultural beauty of our region and also of the pleasure of engaging with a beautiful book. Editor Rose McClarney grew up in Western North Carolina and now teaches at Auburn University. She has written 3 books of poetry and has won the Fellowship of Southern Writers New Writing Award for Poetry. Laura Grace Street teaches at Randolph College in Lynchburg, Virginia, and is the author of 2 poetry collections and the recipient of many fellowships and awards. Ehle Gaddy is a South Carolina naturalist and the author of 3 well-received books. In this anthology, they work in the tradition of 19th century field guides that they describe as colorful books that might weave quotes from poetry or lively personal anecdotes into factual content. The book celebrates our biodiverse Southern Appalachian ecosystem and the rich and diverse community of writers and illustrators who represent the cultural wealth of our region. The anthology includes the work of established writers like Wendell Berry, Robert Morgan, Mary Oliver, and Ron Rash, and offers many unexpected delights from a range of regional and emerging writers. The illustrations and scientific descriptions go beyond simpler tools for identification and classification that we find in modern field guides and prompt us to appreciate the world around us in new ways. Selection Committee member Leslee Johnson writes, "A literary field guide to Southern Appalachia is beautiful in the way it showcases a diversity of voices, including the voices of the plants and animals of Western North Carolina. The book weaves together words, science, and art, bringing the natural world to life on the page. We are grateful that Rose McClarney and Laura Grace Street are here tonight to share a selection."
Thank you so much for everything. This is quite an honor. I'm Laura Grace Street, one of the co-editors of A Literary Field Guide to Southern Appalachia, along with Rose McClarney, who initiated this project and invited me into it, for which I am very grateful. Our natural history editor is Ehle Gaddy. A Literary Field Guide to Southern Appalachia is an anthology that represents 60 regional species with poems, natural history accounts, and art. So in addition to our thanking the organizers of this award for recognizing this book, thank you very much. We also want to thank the more than 70 contributing poets and artists. I won't be able to name them all. But the one poem Rose is going to read was written by Adrian Blevins for The Gray Fox, and we think the sweep of its lines does begin to suggest the diversity of work being created by writers in our region and its biodiversity.
I will say thank you everyone as well, and thank you Laura Gray. So yes, this poem is called Fox Heart, and it is by Adrian Blevins. There is no La Leche League in the Appalachian rainforest in my heart. There is no Gap, no Eileen Fisher, no Wi-Fi, no Dollar General. But for 500 million years at least, there was enough chestnut and little leaf sneezeweed and Carolina parakeet for everybody in the Appalachian rainforest in my heart, and in actual reality, plus megatons of satiny swarms of freshwater mussels, the pearly shells of which make good ashtrays, and southern bog lemming and woodland bison and elk, plus actual passenger pigeon and certain kinds of big-eared bats and shrews. The freshwater mussels these days, like the wild leek and the mountain alder and the pirate bush, are turning to an invisible blur in the old rivers of the Appalachian rainforest in my heart, and in actual reality, not to even mention the shrimp-like crayfish that dare us to swallow alive at 4-H to prove what hillbillies we were and how much we loved the forest and everything already dead and dying in it. So of course I stood there on stage in that hunting lodge and shut my eyes to imagine the gray fox also in my heart, and in reality, as the fox is one of the high priests of all this listing, by which I just mean the main gumption behind it, mostly because she's still flourishing in her slide in with the scattered bones like a fence line outside, since she's too busy not to be messy and far too hungry not to sleep all day and hunt all night, and too maternal and sneaky not to steal chickens for her pups, and too curious not to stare at everything forever, to discern it. The gray fox can even climb trees and is therefore also part coon and cat, and I do mourn the mountain lion. I remember as a child the bobcat's call, and I do mourn never seeing a flying squirrel or star-nosed mole or a bog turtle or a diamond darter or a spruce fir moss spider, and hate not even knowing what a hellbender is. But still, I stood there on stage in that 4-H hunting lodge in my beloved Blue Ridge at the age of 8 and shut my eyes to call up the gray fox hiding out in a little den in the shadow of my hillbilly heart to get the guts to open my mouth and swallow that crayfish live so I could learn, I think, to bide my time, till I could sing this story of our unforgivable sins and try and say, what a fierce little forever thing, at least our sorrow is.
Thank you so much to both of you for bringing this collection together and reminding us of the insights we can gain from beautiful words and beautiful pictures. Our next finalist is Dale Neal. Dale Neal is the author of the novels Appalachian Book of the Dead, The Half-Life of Home, and Cows Across America, all set in the Blue Ridge Mountains. His short fiction and essays have appeared in Arts and Letters, Carolina Quarterly, Marlborough Review, Crescent Review, and many other literary journals. A graduate of the MFA program for writers at Warren Wilson College, he has been awarded fellowships to the Virginia Center for the Creative Arts, Hambidge Center, and the Knight Center for Specialized Journalism at the University of Maryland. He describes himself as one of the last surviving American journalists and was a prize-winning writer for the Asheville Citizen-Times, covering entrepreneurs, technology, police, local government, religion, arts, books, and Cherokee culture. He currently teaches fiction at the Lenore Ryan University Graduate Center in Asheville. The Appalachian Book of the Dead is described as a metaphysical thriller, a meditation on recovery and reincarnation, marriage and betrayal, death and rebirth, an exploration of how our fears give flesh to our hungry ghosts. The novel begins as Angel Jones escapes from a prison work crew and leaves behind a trail of victims before disappearing into the deep woods in Fiona, North Carolina. Believed dead, but his body never found, Angel's presence haunts the residents of a remote mountain community. Cal and Joy McAllister are new arrivals from Chicago. A retired commodity trader, self-sober alcoholic, and heart attack survivor, Cal finds himself growing restless with his third wife. Joy, a physical therapist turned potter, wants to reshape her life and marriage. The caretaker of a girls' summer camp next door, Doyle Smathers becomes their handyman, fetching Cal a batch of fake moonshine and building Joy a kiln. He's also caring for a new guest, Ainsley Morse, the camp owner's granddaughter, who's detoxing herself from a troubled past with Buddhist meditation, while living alone in a yurt on the mountainside. Angel's energy drives these four people together and apart in unexpected ways. Selection committee member Jim Stokely wrote, "Traditionally, a Book of the Dead is meant to help the deceased journey to their place of rebirth. In Appalachian Book of the Dead, Dale Neal tells a story of multiple life transitions among a small group of southern mountain natives and transplants, each of whom has been wounded in some way. Neal's characters come alive and interact in wild and wonderful ways." We are now privileged to hear from author Dale Neal.
Thanks so much. I'd like to thank the Western North Carolina Historical Association and this wonderful virtual audience tonight. I'm truly honored to be counted among these talented writers here tonight who prove the real rich literary diversity of our region. We are more than moonshine and snake handlers, hillbilly elegies, and those other stereotypes we all know. I want to pay tribute to, of course, Asheville's own Thomas Wolfe. That was my first literary god when I encountered Look Homeward Angel at the age of 16. Eugene Gant would prove more of a realistic role model for a sensitive boy than Tarzan of the Apes. A stone, a leaf, an unfound door. Through Wolfe's wonderful book, I discovered my calling in life. And the writer's life did lead me to create Appalachian Book of the Dead. Flannery O'Connor famously said that the South is Christ-haunted, but I've come to believe that karma is as natural a part of our landscape as kudzu. So I wanted to write a Southern Buddhist thriller, sort of Cormac McCarthy meets the Dalai Lama, as I told my publisher. And as Catherine said, the book does begin with this killer disappearing like a ghost into the woods. But then it really does focus on those folks living in that community after that unsuccessful manhunt. And one of my characters, a young woman living in a yurt on the mountainside, is grieving a boyfriend lost to drug addiction. And she's reading from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And that ancient Buddhist scripture talks of the different realms that the dead dream their way through, confronting their deepest fears, which are cleverly disguised as demons. So I wanted to follow these characters as they face their own fears, grieving their old ghosts, trying to make new lives for themselves here in our ancient mountains. So I'm just going to read the opening page for you, Appalachian Book of the Dead. With his mind so neatly made up, Richard Peabody never saw them coming. Through the miasma of overpriced petroleum wafting from the gas tank of his dusty Seville, he'd never even considered in his biblically allotted 70 years the prospect of such pure meanness, crossing his path a quarter mile from the brick rancher he'd shared with his first and only wife, where last Easter they'd burned their 30-year mortgage in the hearth. Paying no mind, pumping his premium at the Gas and Go out Highway 9, Peabody, a retired CPA, Braves fan, and Presbyterian vestryman, sniffed for his favorite vice from the boiled peanut stand at the parking lot's crumbled edge. Steam from the cast iron kettle rose against the curtain of kudzu that choked the scrub woods. The summer's hatch of insects screamed in the imprisoned shade. Too late, he heard, "Mister, can I ask you something?" What? Peabody could smell him before he saw him, the lanky youth in the orange jumpsuit, reeking of work crew sweat. No, he didn't think so. No good came from talking to strangers, young ones at that, who always asked Peabody to buy them beer. He never saw the second one, only felt the blow from behind. The hose snatched from the tank and wound tight about his windpipe, the gas pumping against his pulse. Their swift hands dug through his suspended trousers for his keys, loose change, money clip, cell phone. He drifted into darkness, then came to with a splash of high-test petroleum on his face. "Tell me, mister, you smoke?" He couldn't see a face, only the back of a hand painstakingly tattooed to depict a naked woman struggling in a demon's claw. The inked hand loomed larger, holding a plastic butane lighter, and he heard the small scraping of the wheel before the world flashed white. At a station too cheap for security cameras, the sole witness was the black man in the peanut shack, half blind with glaucoma, who saw the fatal flash, a fire juggling arms and legs as the Seville fishtailed from the parking lot, where what little was left of Richard Peabody lay incinerated. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gail, for that a passage that will probably get lots of people to read that book, and thank you for your ongoing work. And now we want to hear from our 2020 Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award winner. Sandra Muse Isaacs is of Eastern Cherokee and Gaelic heritage. She is Professor of Indigenous Literature and a President's Indigenous Peoples Scholar at Windsor University in Windsor, Ontario, where she earned a bachelor's degree in Honors English and a master's degree in English and Creative Writing. She earned her doctorate in English and Cultural Studies at McMaster University. Her field of research is in Indigenous literature and critical theory, Indigenous oral storytelling, orality theory, oral histories, creative writing, and post-colonialism. She writes that she examines the parallels between Indigenous oral traditions and their earth-connected teachings, which are becoming more pertinent with the changing global climate and recognition of the damage to the earth caused by human practices of resource extraction, stealing the life-giving bloods of the earth. Much of Indigenous literature is based on the ancient oral stories, which are the foundation of the 500+ nations and tribes throughout Turtle Island, North America. And in my courses, we look for ways that the old storytelling appears within the written works of literature. I'm also interested in the intersection of Cherokee society and that of early Scottish settlers, along with the parallels between Indigenous stories. Eastern Cherokee Stories, A Living Oral Tradition and Its Cultural Continuance, is Dr. Muse Isaacs' first book and part of the University of Oklahoma Press Cherokee Studies line. The work documents and examines Eastern Cherokee oral tradition as both an ancient and contemporary literary form, with emphasis on cultural survivance, nationhood, indigenous resistance, and tribal sovereignty, along with its modern usage in land reclamation, cultural regeneration, and language revitalization amongst a highly literate and technical Native American band in the southern Appalachian Mountains. Sandra Muse Isaacs in Eastern Cherokee Stories helps the reader see the oral tradition of the Eastern Cherokee as both an ancient and contemporary means of expressing culture and identity. She allows us to see the ways in which stories continue to have the power to educate and motivate a people rooted in a deep respect and understanding of all living things. For her scholarship and for offering us a new lens on the original people of our region, Dr. Muse Isaacs was chosen as the winner of the Thomas Wolfe Memorial Literary Award for 2020. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and we look forward to your reading.
Thank you, Catherine. And I want to thank the WNCHA for this award and honor on behalf of those talented storytellers and language speakers on the Qualla Boundary who keep this knowledge alive. And thanks to the Historical Association for recognizing the beauty and truth of Cherokee stories. These aren't legends or myths, words which have such a fictional or magical connotation. They're not concocted out of someone's imagination and brought to life in the telling. These aren't fairy tales that are told to children. These stories are indeed truths and realities for the Chalagi people. These stories have existed since the beginning of time. Those original words were spoken not long after the formation of the mountains that make up the Cherokee homeland. In the creation story, it's the non-humans, the animals, and Chichqua, the birds, who cooperate and work together, using their particular talents to help form this beautiful and bountiful homeland where the Cherokees have lived ever since. This story tells of life in the sky with all beings living on a sky island. And when it became too crowded, council was held with the animals and birds, and a collective decision was made to move below the sky island. But first, the mountains had to be made. My book is not a collection of stories, but rather an examination of some of the best known ones that make up the foundation of this indigenous culture and society. Cherokee writer Thomas King says, "The truth about stories is, that's all we are." That's always made perfect sense to me. Oral narratives are a method of communicating the past to people in the present, keeping alive the voices, memories, and traditions of the ancestors. Cherokee writer Robert Conley explains that for Native people, storytelling is much more than entertainment or education. He said, "It's vital and necessary to continued life, the life of the tribe and the life of the world itself. Creation stories are told ritually to ensure the continued existence of the world." For the Chelagi, these are not just the familiar creation and origin stories that explain how our mountain homeland was made for us, or how Shelu, the corn mother, brought corn to the people, or even how the water spider delivered fire to the Cherokee. These origin stories also explain the role of the various non-human creatures, how a particular town or community came to exist, why a certain name was given to a particular earth place, or how a specific ceremony was born, and how it is to always be conducted, and who is to have this responsibility. Cherokees have been telling stories since the beginning of their existence, and will undoubtedly continue to do so as long as there are Cherokees living, in order for us to always remember our connections to Mother Earth. For without that, we could not continue to exist. Stories are not only told by individual community recognized storytellers, but are often held and known collectively by a small or larger group of people within the community or tribe who have either witnessed or participated, or have a family member who has, in certain events that have had a rippling effect and deep impact upon the entire Cherokee Nation. It is these lesser known intergenerational stories, some originary and some explanatory, and many contemporary, that interest me. The contemporary ones share how life and land for the people have changed since the European invasion, and how the Cherokees have adapted. But I prefer not to call them post-colonial, for that gives too much importance to the colonizer. It's better to see how the Cherokees have indigenized many of the inventions that the Europeans brought with them, and how very different the newcomers were compared to the indigenous peoples of this land. And I've been curious about how the old stories are kept alive, and how these ancient explanations of how things came to be continue to have relevancy for today's Cherokees. Now, my book project came about because I've long been fascinated by the power and vitality of spoken word stories. As listeners, we embody them. They stay in our memory much longer than stories we've read. Many of us have childhood experiences of listening to someone telling us bedtime stories, which are so vastly different than reading bedtime stories. Sitting and hearing a story is comforting and nurturing for the spirit. And there are many more storytellers amongst the Eastern Cherokee than are in this book, because the oral tradition is not just the ancient stories. Rather, it's also the stories that are told on a daily basis, in families, within the various communities on the boundary, at public events, in the grocery store, or standing in line at the post office. And although these are modern narratives, they reflect the ancient beings and demonstrate, as Cherokee writer Chris Tooten says, how oral stories are contextualized within everyday conversations. These stories that I've examined are told frequently, and in this way, the Cherokee culture is regenerated, the language is revitalized, and ancient lifeways are reclaimed. Parts of the Cherokee homeland and the ancient mounds are repatriated through the stories that explain how those sacred mounds were the centerpiece of the dozens of villages from a time long before the colonizer arrived. Gadua, Nikwasi, Kawi are some of those mounds that have returned to the people. I want to explain the methods that I use to examine and somewhat analyze some of these old stories. First, I should say that when a Cherokee story is told, there's no real conclusion. There's no, and they lived happily ever after. Sometimes that's because where one story seems to end, another one begins. Or I suggest in the old days, when telling a story could take a very long time, the stories were simply connected and were a continuation from the previous one. And Cherokee storytellers don't tell you how to think or how to interpret a story or what it means, because a story will mean something different to each person who hears it. What a moral to a story is up to you. It's not like Aesop's fables from Greek culture. No need to say, and the moral of the story is, you take from it what is best for you at this point in time in your life, and interpretation is based on your own life experience. Now, as a professor and scholar of literature, I was trained in post-colonialism. I learned about post-colonial theory, but it was never a comfortable fit for me, as my dear advisor Daniel Coleman knows. I must say that Western critical theory simply doesn't work when examining Indigenous oral tradition. Let's just say it's apples and oranges. It was vital to find another method of discussing these stories. Give me just a moment. I chose to privilege, first of all, a Cherokee methodology, while also making use of other Indigenous critical theories proposed by both Native and non-Native scholars alike. In order to begin to understand these enduring oral stories from a Cherokee perspective, I turned to concepts within the Gadua worldview that are also ancient and enduring, as these ideologies continue to play a vital part of contemporary Eastern Cherokee life on the Qualla boundary. These concepts or cultural values are known as Gadugi and Diyakta. Gadugi is explained as people coming together as one and helping one another. And Diyakta describes the right path of walking or living, in that we should strive for harmony, peace, and balance, and kindness at all times. The first represents a communal action, while the latter is more individual. Gadugi is held within one's heart and spirit in order that one will always do good for all those around, and also not become overwhelmed with selfishness, but rather always share and help others. The oral teachings encourage everyone to think of the whole community first and recognize our individual responsibilities within the group. Through the chapters of the book, I show how the ancients, both human and non-humans, always thought ahead to those 7 generations yet to come and preserved the harmony and balance among the earth's creatures, respecting each other and the right to live as the Creator meant for each being to live. The word Gadugi may not have been used within these stories, but the behavior of each being in the stories gives evidence of this concept. Their actions created an underlying sense of community and egalitarianism, and always doing what is best for everyone, rather than just what is best for one or a few. I also use the concept of Diyakta, or the right path to walk and live, and I trace how the oral tradition teaches the best way to proceed along a life path that is balanced and in harmony with all of the rest of creation. The teachings of Diyakta encourage Cherokees, young and old, to care for themselves and to have self-respect and self-love in order that we may carry within and have that love, kindness, and respect for every other creature around us, not just every other human around us. Diyakta means to recognize how all parts of our being, body, spirit, mind, and heart, must be fed and nurtured by all that we do. This is why Cherokees are encouraged to pray and attend ceremonies or church, to take part in sports and physical activities, to participate in community events designed to bring everyone together, to laugh, sing, and dance, and to always help others around us so that everyone and every creature can also live in harmony. Walking the right path is necessary if one wants to be a Yomi Oshta, or a good human being. There is no room for negative thoughts and behavior, because those things will make a person sick and unhealthy. When one is balanced and in harmony with all of creation, one will be healthy and happy and able to contribute to keeping the entire group happy and well. To practice Diyukta means that we are helping ourselves and thus the group as we walk the path the Creator wishes us to walk. Diyukta is an all-encompassing way for a person to, at all times, consider every living part of the environment and natural world around us, and to make every effort to always behave appropriately so that other beings and their purpose on earth is respected and honored. In these times of a pandemic, climate change, and global warming, ancient Cherokee stories are even more important and are a tool to correct and repair these dangers to the earth and all existing beings who live upon her. Indeed, all Indigenous stories are valuable, all Indigenous stories, for learning how to once again live in a respectful and reciprocal manner with the rest of creation. As humans, we've lost the close connection with our ecosystems around us. Humans continue to take and take and take with little care to the death and destruction our actions wreak upon Earth, who sustains us. If you listen to and read stories from any Indigenous nation across Turtle Island and truly absorb the teachings and consider concepts like Gadugi or Diyukta, you will learn what we all have to do. Live in harmony and balance like our ancestors did. Because all peoples of the world, no matter what your ethnicity is, came from tribal societies. Finally, I want to say a quick shki thank you to the storytellers, Kathy Littlejohn, Lloyd Arnich, Freeman Owl, and Davy Arch, for keeping these stories alive and for all you have taught me. Shki, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Muse. And to all of our finalists, Leah Hampton, Susan Keefe and Roberta Jackson, Courtney Lewis, Rose McClarney and Laura Gray Street, and Dale Neal. This has been just a really wonderful evening. I want to remind everyone that any of these books would make a fine holiday gift for yourself or for someone else. I think that Anne will have a slide that will give you more information about that. We want you to support these authors and your local bookstore. And if you already have all of these books, a membership to the Western North Carolina Historical Association is another gift that keeps giving. I want to just end by thanking the selection committee and Ann Chesky-Smith and Jacqueline Lowe for their work putting this evening together. Thanks to everyone. Ann?
Yes, thank you all for coming. On behalf of the Board of Trustees of the Western North Carolina Historical Association, I want to thank everyone here, but especially all the authors who, I know publishing local books like this is not a huge moneymaker, and so we know that it's a huge labor of love to be able to put these things together and keep our history and our culture alive. So I do want to just really give a big, we don't have an audience here to give you all a big round of applause, but imagine that it's happening, and we really thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. Good night.